society of ladies need scarcely be remarked, but with Mrs. Wycherley the two titles were all sufficient. Coarseness became humour, vulgarity softened itself down into the most charming eccentricity, insolence took the guise of an easy absence of reserve, attainable only by those who had had the good fortune to mix with high folks. If the mistress put such a construction upon the behaviour of her new friends, what could the companion urge against them? If they accustomed themselves to very little restraint before the lady of the house, with how much more freedom could they address her paid dependent? Nor was this the worst. As the odious Sir Mulberry Hawk attached himself to Kate with less and less disguise, Mrs. Wycherley began to grow jealous of the superior attraction of Miss Nickleby. If this feeling had led to her banishment from the drawing-room when such company was there, Kate would have been only too happy and willing that it should have existed. But unfortunately for her, she possessed that native grace and true gentility of manner, and those thousand nameless accomplishments which give to female society its greatest charm. If these be valuable anywhere, they were especially so where the lady of the house was a mere animated doll. The consequence was, that Kate had the double mortification of being an indispensable part of the circle when Sir Mulberry and his friends were there, and of being exposed, on that very account, to all Miss Wycherley's ill-humoured and caprices when they were gone. She became utterly and completely miserable. Mrs. Wycherley never thrown off the mask with regard to Sir Mulberry, but when she was more than usually out of temper, attributed the circumstance, as ladies sometimes do, to nervous indisposition. However, as this dreadful idea that Lord Frederick Verisopht also was somewhat taken with Kate, and that she, Mrs. Wycherley, was quite a secondary person, dawned upon that lady's mind, and gradually developed itself, she became possessed with a large quantity of highly popular and most virtuous indignation, and felt it her duty as a married lady and a moral member of the society to mention the circumstance to the young person without delay. Accordingly, Mrs. Wycherley broke ground next morning during a pause in the novel reading. "Miss Nickleby," said Mrs. Wycherley, "I wish to speak to you very gravely. I'm sorry to have to do it, upon my word, I'm very sorry, but you leave me no alternative, Miss Nickleby." Here Mrs. Wycherley tossed her head, not passionately, only virtuously, and remarked, with some appearance of excitement, that she feared that palpitation of the heart was coming on again. "Your behaviour, Miss Nickleby," resumed the lady, "is very far from pleasing me, very far. I am very anxious indeed that you should do well, but you may depend on it, Miss Nickleby, you will not, if you go on as you do." "Ma'am!" exclaimed Kate proudly. "Don't agitate me by speaking in that way, Miss Nickleby, don't," said Mrs. Wycherley with some violence, "or you'll compel me to ring the bell." Kate looked at her, but said nothing. "You needn't suppose," resumed Mrs. Wycherley, "that your looking at me in that way, Miss Nickleby, will prevent my saying what I am going to say, which I feel to be a religious duty. You needn't direct your glances towards me," said Mrs. Wycherley, with a sudden burst of spite. "I am not Sir Mulberry, no, nor Sir Frederick Verisopht, Miss Nickleby, nor am I Mr. Pyke, nor Mr. Pluck either." Kate looked at her again, but less steadily than before, and resting her elbow on the table, covered her eyes with her hand. "If such things had been done when I was a young girl," said Mrs. Wycherley (this, by way, must have been some little time before), "I don't suppose anybody would have believed it." "I don't think they would," murmured Kate. "I do not think anybody would believe, without actually knowing it, what I seemed doomed to undergo." "Don't talk to me of being doomed to undergo, Miss Nickleby, if you please," said Mrs. Wycherley, with a shrillness of tone quite surprising in so great an invalid. "I will not be answered, Miss Nickleby. I am not accustomed to be answered, nor will I permit it for an instant. Do you hear?" she added, waiting with some apparent inconsistency for an answer. "I do hear you, ma'am," replied Kate, with a surprise, and with greater surprise than I can express. "I have always considered you a particularly well-behaved young person for your station in life," said Mrs. Wycherley, and as you are a person of healthy appearance, and neat in your dress, and so forth, I have taken an interest in you, as I do still, considering that I owe a sort of duty to that respectable old female, your mother. For these reasons, Miss Nickleby, I must tell you once and for all, and begging you to mind what I say, that I must insist upon your immediately altering your very forward behaviour to the gentlemen who visit at this house. It really is not becoming, said Mrs. Wititterly, closing her chaste eyes as she spoke. It is improper, quite improper. Oh, cried Kate, looking upwards and clasping her hands, is not this too cruel, too hard to bear? Is it not enough that I should have suffered as I have, night and day, that I should have sunk in my own estimation from very shame of having been brought into contact with such people, but I must also be exposed to this unjust and most unfounded charge? You will have the goodness to recollect, Miss Nickleby, said Mrs. Wititterly, that when you use such terms as unjust and unfounded, you charge me, in effect, with stating that which is untrue. Said Kate, with honest indignation, whether you make this accusation of yourself, or at the promoting of others, is alike to me. I say it is vilely, grossly, wilfully untrue. It is possible, cried Kate, that any one of my own sex can have sat by, and not have seen the misery of these men have caused me. It is possible that you, ma'am, can have been present, and failed to mark the insulting freedom that their every look bespoke. It is possible that you can have avoided seeing that these libertines, in their utter disrespect for you, and utter disregard of all gentlemanly behaviour, and almost of decency, have had but one object in introducing themselves here, and that the furtherance of their designs upon the friendless, helpless girl, who without this humiliating confession might have hoped to receive from one so much her senior something like womanly aid and sympathy. I cannot believe it. If poor Kate had possessed the slightest knowledge of the world, she certainly would not have ventured, even in the excitement into which she had been lashed, upon such an injudicious speech as this. Its effect was precisely what a more experienced observer would have foreseen. Mrs. Wititterly received the attack upon her veracity with exemplary calmness, and listened with the most heroic fortitude to Kate's account of her own sufferings. But allusion being made to her being held in disregard by the gentleman, she evinced violent emotion, and this blow was no sooner followed up by the remark concerning her seniority, that she fell back upon the sofa, uttering dismal screams. What is the matter? Cried Mr. Wititterly, bouncing into the room. Heavens, what do I see? Julia! Julia, look up, my life, look up! But Julia looked down, most perseveringly, and screamed still louder. So Mr. Wititterly rang the bell, and danced in a frenzied manner round the sofa on which Mrs. Wititterly lay, uttering perpetual cries for Sir Tumley Snuffim, and never once leaving off to ask for any explanation of the scene before him. Run for Sir Tumley, cried Mr. Wititterly, menacing the page with both fists. I knew it, Miss Nickleby, he said, looking around with an air of melancholy triumph, that society has been too much for her. This is all soul, you know, every bit of it. With this assurance, Mr. Wititterly took up the prostrate form of Mrs. Wititterly, and carried her bodily off to bed. Kate waited until Sir Tumley Snuffim had paid his visit, and looked in with a report that, through the special interposition of a merciful Providence, thus spake Sir Tumley, Mrs. Wititterly had gone to sleep. She then hastily attired herself for walking, and leaving word that she should return within a couple of hours, hurried away toward her uncle's house. It had been a good day with Ralph Nickleby, quite a lucky day, as he walked to and fro in his little back room, with his hands clasped behind him, adding up in his own mind all the sums that had been, or would be, netted from the business done since this morning. His mouth was drawn into a hard, stern smile, while the firmness of the lines and curves that made it up, as well as the cunning glance of his cold bright eye, seemed to tell that if any resolution or cunning would increase the profits, they would not fail to be exerted for the purpose. Very good, said Ralph, in allusion, no doubt, to